In the parish records of St. Mary's Church in Kidderminster, Worcestershire, there exists a marriage certificate dated April 14th, 1808. The groom's name, Thomas Day, aged 32. The bride's name, Sabrina Sidney, aged 21. Unremarkable, you might think. Just another union recorded in fading ink on yellowed parchment. But what those records don't reveal is that 11 years earlier, in 1797, Thomas Day stood as the legal guardian of this same woman. And 13 years before that marriage, in 1795, he was her master in every sense of the word. She called him these three names across the span of her life, and the transformation between each title reveals one of the most disturbing experiments in human conditioning ever conducted by a man the British establishment once called a humanitarian. The documents don't lie, though they were certainly meant to obscure. Thomas Day's own letters, preserved in the archives of the Lichfield Cathedral Library, detail his plans with chilling precision. Letters to his friend Richard Lovell Edgeworth, now housed in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, speak of the perfection of female education and the moulding of an ideal wife. What these men discussed wasn't education. It was creation, the deliberate psychological reconstruction of two young girls plucked from an orphanage to become the perfect submissive spouse for a man who believed women were born defective. Before we go further, I need you to understand something. This channel exists to uncover the stories that powerful people wanted buried. If you appreciate this kind of deep investigation into history's darkest corners, subscribe now. We're just scratching the surface of what really happened behind closed doors in Georgian England. Thomas Day was born in 1748 to a wealthy London family. When his father died in 1749, the infant inherited an estate worth £30,000, an astronomical sum that would be equivalent to roughly £40 million today. This fortune guaranteed him a life of comfort, education at Oxford, and entry into the circles of England's intellectual elite. By his early 20s, Day had become a devoted follower of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher whose work Émile, or On Education, would become Day's blueprint for one of history's most disturbing social experiments. Rousseau's educational philosophy centered on molding children from birth, controlling every aspect of their development to create ideal citizens. Day became obsessed with a particular section of Émile that dealt with the education of Sophie, the ideal woman. According to Rousseau, and by extension Day, women existed in a naturally inferior state. They were emotional, irrational, vain, and obsessed with frivolous pursuits. But Rousseau proposed that a woman, if taken young enough and subjected to the proper conditioning, could be transformed into the perfect companion for a rational man. Day took this theory further than Rousseau ever intended. In his letters to Edgeworth from 1769, Day writes, "I have resolved to take the matter into my own hands. If nature has made woman imperfect, then I shall perfect her through science and discipline. I shall find her in her most unformed state and remake her entirely." The evidence suggests Day began planning his experiment sometime in late 1768. He was 20 years old. He had already been rejected by multiple women of his social class, including Honora Sneyd, a beautiful heiress who found Day's appearance and manners repulsive. Day stood just over 5 feet tall, refused to bathe regularly as part of his devotion to natural living, and wore unfashionable clothes as a statement against vanity. Multiple accounts from contemporaries describe him as having crooked teeth, unwashed hair, and a body odor that preceded him into any room. But Day didn't see his rejections as personal failures. He saw them as proof that women of society had been corrupted beyond redemption. They valued appearance over virtue, wealth over character, fashion over philosophy, so he decided to create his own wife, one who would be grateful for his attention, molded to his specifications, and psychologically incapable of the defiance that other women showed him. On June 11th, 1769, Thomas Day walked into the Shrewsbury Foundling Hospital, accompanied by his friend Richard Lovell Edgeworth and a lawyer named John Bicknell. The documents they carried gave them legal authority to remove 2 children from the institution. The girls they selected were 11-year old Ann Kingston and 12-year old Dorcas Carr. Day chose them specifically because they were described in the orphanage records as light-haired, pale, and of unremarkable countenance. He didn't want beauty. He wanted blank slates. The orphanage matron, a Mrs. Elizabeth Horton, noted in her diary, which is now preserved in the Shropshire archives, that Day examined both girls as one might examine livestock. He checked their teeth, had them walk back and forth, and asked them to read simple passages. Her entry for June 11th reads, Mr. Day seemed most satisfied when the girls showed neither fear nor boldness. He said to Mr. Edgeworth that these 2 possessed the neutral temperament required for deep impression. Day renamed them immediately. Ann Kingston became Sabrina after the River Severn, which flowed near where he intended to conduct his experiment. Dorcas Carr became Lucretia, after the Roman woman whose virtue Rousseau had praised. The erasure of their birth names was the first step in erasing their former selves. What I'm about to describe comes directly from Day's own writings, preserved because he was foolish enough or arrogant enough to document his methods in detail. He wanted his experiment to be reproducible. He imagined other rational men following his example, creating perfect wives from orphan girls, improving the female sex through systematic conditioning. Day took Sabrina and Lucretia to France. Not the France of Paris and society, but a remote village in the Rhone Valley called Avignon, where he rented a small house far from English law and English gossip. For 18 months, those girls lived in complete isolation with a man who controlled every aspect of their existence. His letters to Edgeworth describe the daily routine. The girls rose at dawn. They were not permitted to speak unless spoken to. They ate plain food, wore simple clothing, and received no information about the outside world. Day taught them reading and writing, but only from books he selected: philosophy, natural history, and agricultural texts. Nothing romantic, nothing that might inflame the female imagination with unrealistic expectations. Day's educational philosophy included what he called toughening exercises. He believed women were naturally weak and fearful, and these traits had to be systematically eliminated. From a letter dated September 1769, now in the Edgeworth Papers at the National Library of Ireland, Day writes, "Today I tested Sabrina's fortitude by dropping hot sealing wax upon her arms without warning. She cried out, which shows we have far to progress. A rational woman should master her sensations and understand that momentary pain is meaningless compared to philosophical truth. I shall repeat the exercise until she learns silence. The hot wax wasn't the worst of it." Day's letters describe holding loaded pistols near the girls' faces and firing them without warning, testing whether they would flinch. He threw them into deep water to see if they would panic or swim calmly. He woke them at random hours of the night with loud noises to condition them against startled reactions. All of this, he insisted, was necessary to burn away their natural female weakness and forge something stronger, more rational, more perfectly obedient. By early 1771, Day had decided that Lucretia was unsuitable for his purposes. At 13 years old, she had begun to show what Day called incorrigible defects of character. From what we can piece together from his correspondence, Lucretia had started to cry during the conditioning exercises. She had spoken back to him. She had tried in small ways to resist. Day returned to England with both girls and immediately apprenticed Lucretia to a milliner in London. He gave her £5 and never contacted her again. Lucretia essentially vanishes from the historical record after 1771. We know she married a man named Charles Lucas in 1782 from a marriage record in St. Giles Church, but nothing more. Day erased her from his experiment as easily as he had renamed her. But Sabrina he kept. Sabrina, it seemed, had shown the proper submissiveness. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, because what you're hearing is meticulously researched history that mainstream documentaries won't touch. Day returned to Lichfield and installed 13-year-old Sabrina in the home of a woman named Mrs. Elizabeth Montagu, but make no mistake, Day still controlled every aspect of Sabrina's life. He visited regularly to continue her education. He read her lessons in philosophy. He tested her obedience with his conditioning exercises. And he began to introduce a new element into their relationship, the suggestion that she would one day become his wife. Contemporary accounts from Anna Seward, the so-called Swan of Lichfield, whose letters are preserved in the Staffordshire Record Office, provide chilling glimpses into Day's treatment of Sabrina during this period. Seward wrote to a friend in March 1772, "I saw Mr. Day walking with his young ward in the Cathedral Close. The girl moved with unnatural stillness, her hands clasped before her, her eyes downcast. When Day stopped walking, she stopped instantly, as a dog stops at its master's command. He spoke to her occasionally, and she answered in monosyllables. There was something profoundly disturbing in the scene, though I could not name precisely what troubled me. The girl seemed absent, somehow, not present in her own body. Day's plan was proceeding. Sabrina was learning to anticipate his wishes, to move when he wanted her to move, to be silent when silence pleased him, to speak when speech was required. She was being trained in every functional sense, like an animal responding to invisible cues. But Day had a problem. As Sabrina grew older, she began to develop her own thoughts. Small acts of independence started to appear. She began choosing books to read without his permission. She spoke to Mrs. Montagu about subjects Day hadn't introduced. She expressed opinions on matters he considered beyond her understanding. In 1773, Day decided he needed to isolate Sabrina more completely. He moved her to a small cottage on his estate in Lichfield, where she would live alone under the supervision of a housekeeper who reported directly to Day. Sabrina was 15 years old. Day was 25. The letters from this period reveal Day's growing frustration. To Edgeworth, he writes in November 1773, "Sabrina shows disturbing signs of vanity. She asked for a looking-glass, which I refused. She has begun to arrange her hair in ways that suggest an awareness of appearance. The female nature resists improvement with remarkable persistence. I fear I may have begun my work too late. The corruption of society had already touched her before I rescued her from that institution. What Day called corruption we might recognize as a teenage girl developing a normal sense of self. But in Day's philosophy, any self that wasn't entirely created by him was defective. He increased the intensity of his conditioning. His letters describe more frequent fortitude tests, more sudden loud noises, more dropped hot wax, more firearms discharged near her head. He was trying to break something in her, to shatter whatever independent will was emerging. And yet Sabrina remained. Where else could she go? She had no family, no money, no legal rights. Day controlled everything, her home, her food, her future. She was utterly trapped in this experiment, and she knew it. The years between 1773 and 1780 are poorly documented, which is itself suspicious. Day's letters become less frequent, less detailed. He stops describing his specific methods. But we know Sabrina remained in his custody throughout this period. We know she continued to live in isolation on his estate. And we know that by 1780, when Sabrina was 22 and Day was 32, something had changed in their relationship. Day began courting another woman. Her name was Esther Milnes, a well-connected heiress from a respectable family. Day, it seems, had decided that his experiment with Sabrina had failed. She had not become the perfectly submissive, emotionless, rational companion he had envisioned. She still showed signs of independent thought, of emotions, of humanity. So Day went looking for a conventional wife among conventional society, the same society he had once scorned. But here's where the story becomes even darker. Day didn't release Sabrina, he didn't provide for her independence, he simply kept her. She remained living in the cottage under his control while he courted Esther Milnes. The courtship failed. Esther's family investigated Day's background and discovered Sabrina. The rumours that circulated, preserved in letters between Lichfield Society members, suggested that Day and Sabrina had a sexual relationship, though Day always insisted publicly that he had never touched her. Whether this was true or not, Esther's family forbade the marriage. They didn't want their daughter connected to a man who kept a young woman in such ambiguous circumstances. Day then courted Honora Snade's sister, Elizabeth. This courtship also failed. Then he pursued another heiress, Mary Lee. Another failure. It seemed Day was incapable of forming relationships with women who had the power to refuse him. In 1780, Day met Esther Milnes again. For reasons that remain unclear, she agreed to marry him despite her family's objections. They wed in August 1780. Day was 32, Esther was 24, and Sabrina remained in the cottage. Let that sink in for a moment. Day had spent 11 years, from the time Sabrina was 11 until she was 22, conditioning her to be his perfect wife. He had subjected her to psychological and physical abuse, isolated her from society, controlled every aspect of her development. And then, when she failed to meet his impossible standards, he married someone else and kept Sabrina as, what exactly the documents don't say. Day's letters from this period never mention her name. But the parish records tell us that Sabrina continued to live on Day's estate even after his marriage. A woman named Anna Seward, who had been observing Day's behaviour for years, wrote in a letter dated December 1780, "The new Mrs. Day must possess a remarkably tolerant disposition, or a remarkably ignorant one. That unfortunate girl remains in the cottage, though her purpose, if she ever had one, has clearly been superseded. One wonders if Day keeps her as one might keep a failed experiment in a jar, preserved as evidence of an attempt made. Day died on September 28th, 1789, at the age of 41. The cause was a horse-riding accident. He had been trying to break an untrained colt using his own methods, refusing to follow conventional wisdom about horse training. The horse threw him, and he struck his head on a stone wall. He died within hours, never regaining consciousness. His will, preserved in the National Archives at Kew, includes a provision for Sabrina. He left her an annual income of £40, enough to live modestly. But the language of the bequest is telling. To Sabrina Sidney, whom I have maintained these many years, I leave an income sufficient for her support, in recognition of her service to my philosophical inquiries. Service to his philosophical inquiries. That's how he described over 2 decades of her life. But this is where the story takes an even stranger turn, because Sabrina's ordeal didn't end with Day's death. John Bicknell had been Day's friend and lawyer, the man who had accompanied him to the Shrewsbury Foundling Hospital in 1769. After Day's death, Bicknell took an interest in Sabrina's welfare. Some historians have suggested this interest was benevolent. Others have noted that Bicknell, like Day, was a follower of Rousseau's philosophy. In 1790, a year after Day's death, Bicknell arranged for Sabrina to move to London, where he helped establish her in a boarding house for genteel women. He oversaw her finances. He visited her regularly. He introduced her to his circle of friends, and then, in 1792, Bicknell proposed marriage. Sabrina accepted. Why, we can only speculate. Perhaps she saw it as security. Perhaps, after 23 years of psychological conditioning to defer to male authority, she was incapable of refusing. Perhaps she had developed what we would now recognize as a trauma bond with the men who had controlled her life. We're about to reveal what investigators found next, but first, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss stories like this. The documents that follow reveal a pattern that historians have tried for 2 centuries to explain away. John Bicknell was 48 years old when he married 32-year-old Sabrina Sidney in April 1792. The wedding took place at St. George's Church in Bloomsbury, a fashionable London parish far from the scenes of her earlier life. The marriage record describes Bicknell as barrister at law, and Sabrina as spinster of this parish. No mention of Day. No mention of the Foundling Hospital. No mention of anything that would reveal her true history. Bicknell died in 1794, just 2 years after the marriage. Sabrina was a widow at 34, having spent her entire adult life under the control of Day's philosophical circle. And this is where the story becomes nearly impossible to believe, yet the documents are irrefutable. After Bicknell's death, Sabrina moved back to the Midlands. She settled in a small house in Birmingham, living on the income from Bicknell's estate, combined with Day's original bequest. By all accounts, she lived quietly, rarely venturing into society, rarely speaking to neighbours. Then, in 1803, a man named Joseph Paget began visiting her regularly. Paget was a lawyer who had known both Day and Bicknell. He was 61 years old. Sabrina was 43. They married in 1804. The marriage record is held in the Birmingham archives. Joseph Paget, widower, barrister. Sabrina Bicknell, widow, of independent means. Paget died in 1807. 3 years later, Sabrina married again. The groom's name in the 1808 marriage record is listed as Thomas Sidney. But here's what makes this final marriage so profoundly disturbing. Thomas Sidney was the son of John Bicknell. He was Sabrina's stepson from her second marriage. The parish records show that Thomas Sidney was born in 1771, which means he was 16 years old when his father married Sabrina in 1792. He would have been 18 when his father died, leaving Sabrina as his stepmother. He was 37 when he married her in 1808, making Sabrina 48 years old. She had been his stepmother, now she was his wife. The registers at St. Mary's Church in Kidderminster list Thomas Sidney as a clerk and Sabrina as a widow. There is no notation of their previous relationship, no indication that this marriage violated any social or moral boundary. It was simply recorded as another union, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know the history. But we know the history, and when you trace the line from 1769 to 1808, you see a pattern of domination and control that spanned 40 years. From the moment Thomas Day pulled 11, year-old Ann Kingston from that orphanage, Sabrina lived under the authority of men who had known Day, subscribed to his philosophies, and participated in his circle. She went from Day's ward to Day's kept woman to Bicknell's wife to Paggett's wife to her own stepson's wife. At no point in this chain did she exist independently. At no point did she escape the network of men who had been present at the beginning of her ordeal. The evidence suggests that Sabrina was passed from man to man within this philosophical circle, each one taking responsibility for maintaining her after the previous one died. Whether this was done out of genuine concern for her welfare or out of a shared belief that she remained, fundamentally, property of the experiment is impossible to determine with certainty, but the pattern speaks for itself. Sabrina Sidney died on April 2nd, 1843, at the age of 83. She died in a small house in Kidderminster, still married to Thomas Sidney. Her death certificate, preserved in the General Register Office, lists the cause of death as natural decay. She is buried in an unmarked grave in the churchyard of St. Mary's, her location within the yard unknown because the burial records from that year are incomplete. She left no children, no personal writings, no diary or letters that survived. Everything we know about Sabrina comes from the men who controlled her. Day's letters about his experiment, Bicknell's legal documents, parish records of her marriages, and observations from contemporaries who saw her as a curiosity, a cautionary tale, or an object of pity. But there is one document that provides a glimpse, however brief, of Sabrina's own voice. It's a letter preserved in the Edgeworth Papers, written in 1831 by Richard Lovell Edgeworth's daughter, Maria Edgeworth, the novelist. Maria had met Sabrina once in 1830, when Sabrina was 70 and Maria was 63. Maria writes, "I spent an afternoon with Mrs. Sidney, the woman who was the subject of Mr. Day's unfortunate experiment so many years ago. She is quite elderly now, her mind still sharp, though her body is frail. We spoke of inconsequential matters at first, the weather, the state of the roads, her garden, but then, perhaps because she sensed I knew her history, she made a remark that has haunted me since. She said, 'I often wonder what might have become of Ann Kingston, that little girl from the orphanage. I remember her, you see. I remember her face looking back at me from mirrors when I was very young before Mr. Day gave me a new name. Sometimes I think she is still somewhere, waiting for someone to come looking for her.' When I asked her what she meant, she only smiled and said, 'But no one will come looking, of course. She never truly existed, did she?'" That passage, written nearly 60 years after Day began his experiment, reveals the depth of the psychological damage inflicted. Sabrina had been so thoroughly remade, her identity so completely overwritten, that she spoke of her childhood self as a separate person. A person who had been lost, abandoned, erased. The historical record treats Thomas Day as a minor figure of the Enlightenment. He appears in biographies of his more famous friends. His poetry, mediocre as it was, gets mentioned in surveys of 18th century literature. His membership in the Lunar Society of Birmingham, a group of intellectuals and industrialists, earns him footnotes in books about the Industrial Revolution. But the experiment with Sabrina, when it's mentioned at all, is presented as an eccentricity. A strange episode, a misguided attempt at educational theory. The language used is often remarkably gentle. Day's unconventional approach to female education, or Day's failed attempt to create an ideal companion. This is how history obscures abuse. By softening the language, by contextualizing it within intellectual movements, by treating the abuser as a complex figure whose motives, however misguided, came from a place of philosophical inquiry rather than sadistic control. The truth that the documents reveal is far darker. Thomas Day acquired 2 children from an institution designed to protect orphans. He subjected them to systematic psychological and physical abuse for years. When one child showed signs of resistance, he discarded her. The other he kept in a state of dependency and control for 20 years. When she failed to meet his standards, he married someone else but continued to keep her, providing just enough financial support to ensure she remained bound to him. After his death, his associates continued the pattern, marrying her, controlling her, passing her between them like an inheritance. Sabrina lived for 83 years, and for 70, 4 of those years, from the age of 9 until her death. She never lived independently, never chose her own path, never escaped the network of men who had decided, when she was a child, that she existed for their philosophical experimentation. The British establishment never investigated Day's treatment of Sabrina and Lucretia. No authorities intervened, no one faced legal consequences. Day died with his reputation intact, praised in obituaries as a humanitarian and thinker. His experiment was known to his entire social circle, discussed openly in letters, mentioned in memoirs. And no one stopped him. Why? Because in Georgian England, children in orphanages had no rights. Women had no legal autonomy, and men of wealth and education were presumed to be acting rationally, even when their actions were manifestly abusive. The law, such as it existed, saw nothing wrong with a wealthy man taking custody of orphan girls and subjecting them to his educational theories. The law saw nothing wrong with keeping a woman in financial dependency. The law saw nothing wrong with the pattern of marriages that followed, each one legal and properly recorded, regardless of the power dynamics involved. What happened to Sabrina Sidney wasn't hidden because it was illegal. It was hidden because it was embarrassing. It revealed uncomfortable truths about the Enlightenment's blind spots, about the men who claimed to be rational thinkers while treating women and children as objects for experimentation. And so the story was allowed to fade. Sabrina's name disappeared from mainstream histories of the period. When Day is mentioned at all, Sabrina becomes a footnote, an unfortunate episode, quickly passed over on the way to discussing his poetry or his political theories. But the documents remain, Day's letters remain, the marriage records remain, the parish registers remain, and they tell a story that cannot be explained away or softened with euphemism. They tell the story of a child who was taken, renamed, and systematically broken. A child who grew into a woman who could not imagine herself as separate from the men who had created the only identity she knew. A woman who, at 70 years old, spoke of her childhood self as someone lost, someone who had never truly existed. The Enlightenment, we're told, was an age of reason, of progress, of humanitarian advance, and in many ways it was. But it was also an age when reason was used to justify cruelty, when progress meant the right of powerful men to experiment on the powerless, when humanitarian rhetoric coexisted comfortably with the absolute control of women and children. Thomas Day believed he was improving the female sex. He believed his experiment would benefit humanity. He believed history would vindicate his methods and celebrate his results. In his letters, he expresses no doubt about the righteousness of his project. He sees himself as a pioneer, a visionary, a man ahead of his time who understood that women could be perfected through systematic conditioning. The tragedy is that Day was ahead of his time. The methods he developed, the psychological manipulation, the isolation, the systematic breaking of will, the creation of complete dependency, these became the standard techniques of abusers for the next 200 years. Day's experiment was a prototype for domestic abuse, as we understand it today. And Sabrina Sidney, who started life as Ann Kingston, who was renamed and remade and passed between men for 7 decades, who died without leaving a single document in her own voice, who was buried in an unmarked grave and forgotten by history. She was the proof of concept. Her life demonstrates what can be done to a human being when they have no legal protection, no social power, no ability to refuse or escape. It demonstrates how thoroughly a person can be erased while still alive, how completely an identity can be overwritten, how seamlessly abuse can be rebranded as education or care or philosophical inquiry. The archives contain thousands of stories like Sabrina's. They're tucked into private letters, mentioned briefly in memoirs, recorded in dry legal language in dusty registers. Most of them will never be recovered because no one is looking for them. The women and children who suffered are nameless, their experiences reduced to brief mentions in documents that celebrate the men who harmed them. But Sabrina's story survived because Thomas Day was arrogant enough to document his methods. He wanted credit for his experiment. He wanted other men to replicate his approach. He wrote it all down, preserved it in letters to his friends, discussed it openly in his social circle, and so we know. We know what he did. We know how long it lasted. We know that she never escaped. We know that at 70 years old, she remembered the child she had been before Day took her, and she spoke of that child as someone lost forever. The Georgian period, the age of enlightenment, the era of reason and progress, this is the truth that exists beneath those grand historical narratives. This is what reason and progress looked like for women and children who had the misfortune to catch the attention of educated men with theories about human nature. Thomas Day's name appears in histories of English literature, in biographies of the Lunar Society, in discussions of Rousseau's influence on British thought. He is treated as a minor but interesting figure, a man of his time with peculiar ideas but ultimately good intentions. Sabrina Sidney appears nowhere except in the documents that track her movement from man to man, name to name, relationship to relationship. She exists as an object, a data point in someone else's experiment, a footnote to someone else's philosophy. This is how history remembers them, the man who conducted the experiment and the girl who survived it. One gets his name in books, the other gets an unmarked grave. The evidence suggests this is exactly what they both expected. Day believed his experiment would make him famous as the man who perfected female education. Sabrina, conditioned from childhood to believe she existed only in relation to the men who controlled her, probably never imagined she deserved to be remembered at all. She called him master when she was 11, when he first took her from the orphanage and began his experiment. She might have called him husband if his experiment had succeeded, if she had become the perfectly submissive, emotionless creature he tried to create. Instead, she called him nothing for most of her life, because he married someone else and kept her anyway, unnamed in his later letters, unacknowledged in his will except as a recipient of charity. And then she called another man husband, and another, and finally her own stepson, closing a circle of control that had begun when she was a child and ended only with her death at 83. 3 titles across a lifetime: master, husband, son. Each one a form of ownership, each one a link in a chain that was forged in 1769 and never broken. The parish records at St. Mary's Church in Kidderminster are open to the public. Anyone can request to see the marriage register from 1808. Anyone can read the entry, Thomas Sidney, clerk to Sabrina Bicknell, widow. The ink has faded, but the words remain legible. What the register doesn't show is the lifetime of conditioning that led to that signature. What it doesn't reveal is the orphanage in Shrewsbury where it all began. What it doesn't explain is how a child named Ann Kingston became a woman named Sabrina Sidney, who married her stepson and died in an unmarked grave. But the documents exist, the letters exist, the evidence exists. And when you trace the pattern through decades of records, when you piece together the fragments scattered across archives in London, Oxford, Birmingham, and Lichfield, when you read between the lines of letters written by men who saw nothing wrong with what they were describing, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. This wasn't a failed educational experiment. This was a systematic destruction of a person's autonomy that lasted 74 years and involved multiple men who knowingly participated in maintaining absolute control over a woman from childhood until death. And it was legal, and it was accepted, and it was forgotten until now, because the documents don't lie, even when the people who wrote them intended to obscure. The evidence remains, waiting in archives for someone to look closely enough, to ask the right questions, to refuse the sanitized version of history that treats abuse as eccentricity and abusers as complex figures deserving of nuance. Sabrina Sidney deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote to Thomas Day's biography, not as an unfortunate episode in Enlightenment philosophy, but as a person who survived 7 decades of systematic abuse and control, who lived without autonomy from the age of 9 until her death at 83, who was passed between men like property and died without leaving a single document in her own voice. Her story is a reminder that progress is not linear, that reason can be wielded as a weapon, that the same era that produced great advances in science and philosophy also produced men who believed they had the right to experiment on children, and a society that allowed them to do it without consequence. The age of enlightenment, the age of reason, the age of humanitarian progress, and the age of Ann Kingston, who became Sabrina Sidney, who spent her entire life being remade by men who believed they knew better than she did what she should become. The question we're left with is simple. How many other Sabrinas are buried in unmarked graves, their stories scattered across archives, their voices erased by the very men who claimed to be educating them? How many experiments were conducted behind closed doors, documented in private letters, discussed in intellectual circles, and then quietly forgotten when they became inconvenient to the historical narrative? How many children were taken, renamed, and broken in the name of philosophy, progress, and improvement? The documents suggest the answer is many, more than we will ever know, more than the archives will ever reveal. But Sabrina's story survived, and in surviving, it serves as testimony, not just to what happened to her, but to what happened to countless others whose names we will never know. She called him master. Then the men who followed called themselves husbands, and finally she married the son of one of those men, closing a circle that began when she was 11 years old in a Shrewsbury orphanage. 3 titles. 1 lifetime of captivity. This is what the documents reveal. This is what history tried to forget. This is the truth about Sabrina Sidney.